The 24th presidential election took place on November 2nd, 1880. This election consisted of 5 political parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Greenback, Prohibition, and Anti-Masonic parties. The Republican Party chose the representative for Ohio's 19th District, James A. Garfield, as their presidential nominee, and chairman of the New York Republican Party, Chester A. Arthur, as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose Major General Winfield S. Hancock as their presidential nominee, and former representative for Indiana's 2nd District, William H. English, as their vice presidential nominee. In 1880, New York and Indiana were considered the swing states of the time, as local and state elections were decided by close victories. Republicans focused less on their victory in the Civil War, as the issue was moving farther and farther away. Voters were also becoming less excited about wartime generals being on party tickets. Garfield was criticized due to members of his party accepting bribes from railroad companies, even though he himself was not bribed. The downside of the Democrats' campaign was that they did not campaign on policy, and instead focused on campaigning to win. The Greenback Party was criticized by both parties as trying to help their opposition win, as any major party does nowadays. Republicans criticized the Democratic Party for implementing tariffs for the sake of making money and not using them for any strategic purposes. Democrats responded by saying the tariffs were local issues, even though tariffs were not implemented by local governments, rather by state and federal governments. An early sign of Republican victory came when Republicans won local elections in Ohio and Indiana. As immigration from China became an issue, candidates from the Republican, Democratic, and Greenback parties said that they would restrict immigration. James Garfield ended up winning the election. He won 48.32% of the popular vote and 57% of the electoral vote. I wouldn't say this election was very polarizing, but was close due to both parties not focusing much on issues. The 25th presidential election was held on November 4th, 1884. This election consisted of 5 parties and 1 coalition party. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Prohibition, Greenback, Anti-Monopoly, and Equality parties. The coalition party was the Greenbacks and Anti-Monopoly coalition. The Democratic Party chose Governor of New York, Grover Cleveland, as their presidential nominee, and former Governor of Indiana, Thomas A. Hendricks, as their vice presidential candidate. The Republican Party chose former Secretary of State James G. Blaine as their presidential candidate, and Illinois Senator John A. Logan as their vice presidential candidate. This election again focused on the topic of candidates' character rather than policy. Democrats criticized Blaine for accepting over $100,000 worth of bribes and trying to cover it up. Cleveland, on the other hand, was well known for his efforts for cleaning up corruption while he was governor of New York. It was discovered that Cleveland had been hiding a child from the public. Instead of rejecting the claims, Cleveland stated that he wanted to be truthful in his campaign and admitted that he had been paying child support for the child. As things looked good for Cleveland, the mother of the child came out and stated how much she hated that Cleveland was trying to pretend the child did not exist. But the corruption within the Republican Party was seen as worse by the public. A member within Blaine's campaign stated his disapproval for Catholics and was then used by Cleveland to gather Catholic votes. This ended up helping Cleveland win New York. Grover Cleveland ended up winning the election. He won 48.85% of the popular vote and 54.61% of the electoral vote. While Cleveland won a larger portion of the popular vote this election, his electoral vote victory was more narrow. This election was more polarizing than the last due to the Democrats calling Blaine corrupt, while the Republicans criticized Cleveland for trying to hide his child. The 26th presidential election was held on November 6, 1888. This election consisted of 4 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Prohibition, and Union Labor parties. The Republican Party chose former Indiana Senator Benjamin Harrison as their presidential candidate, and former ambassador to France, Levi P. Morton, as their vice presidential candidate. The Democratic Party chose President Grover Cleveland as their presidential candidate, and former Ohio Senator Alan G. Thurman as their vice presidential candidate. The Prohibition Party chose Clinton B. Fisk as their presidential candidate, and John A. Brooks as their vice presidential candidate. The Union Labor Party chose Illinois State Senator Alan Streeter as the presidential candidate, and Charles E. Cunningham as their vice presidential candidate. Cleveland campaigned on tariffs being too high and wanted to bring them down. Republicans stated that the tariffs protected industry within the United States from foreign competition. But the fact was, labor costs in the United States were lower in the United States than in Europe, while quality was better. While Harrison was able to gain a lot of support and media coverage due to him going out and campaigning, Cleveland believed that it was right to hold the tradition of not campaigning during an election, so his party continued to campaign for him rather than he himself. William Wade Dudley, who was treasurer of the RNC, created a program that would find people who voted Democrat in 1884 and pay them to vote Republican in 1888. This led to the creation of secret ballots, or ballots that would not have personal information on it, to prevent people from being able to track you down for voting for a specific party. A man named George Oxgoodby, who moved to the United States from Britain, asked the British ambassador to the United States, Lionel Sackville West, who he should vote for in this upcoming election. West said that from Britain's perspective, Cleveland was the best choice. When this letter was leaked by Republicans, Cleveland ended up losing a lot of support from Irish Catholics. This in itself caused Cleveland to lose both New York and Indiana. Benjamin Harris ended up winning the election. Grover Cleveland won the popular vote by 48.63%, but Harrison won the Electoral College by 58.1%. This election was less polarizing than the last due to campaigns being more about issues than character. The 27th presidential election was held on November 8, 1892. This election consisted of 5 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Republican, Populist, Prohibition, and Socialist Labor. Similar to how Donald Trump is today with the Republican Party. Even though he lost the last election as the incumbent, former President Grover Cleveland was chosen as the Democratic presidential nominee, and former Postmaster General Aldi Stevenson was chosen as the vice presidential nominee. As Harrison did not want to run for re-election, he also didn't want Blaine to become the Republican nominee, so he decided to run for a second term to stop Blaine. The Republican Party chose Benjamin Harrison as their presidential candidate, and ambassador to France, Whitelaw Reid, as their vice presidential candidate. The Populist Party chose former representative for Iowa's 6th District, James B. Weaver, as their presidential nominee, and former Attorney General of Virginia, James G. Field, as their vice presidential nominee. The Prohibition Party chose former representative of California's 3rd District, John Bidwell, as their presidential nominee, and James B. Cranfield as their vice presidential nominee. Both Republicans and Democrats campaigned the same exact stances on tariffs as they did in the previous election. Cleveland campaigned against the protection of voters' rights for African Americans in the South. Harrison was prevented from campaigning as his wife fell ill. After her death, all candidates agreed to end their campaigns in respect for Harrison. Democrats attempted to create a coalition party with the Populists but failed. Grover Cleveland ended up winning the election. This was mostly due to Harrison staying home to take care of his wife. Cleveland won 46.02% of the popular vote and 62.39% of the electoral vote. This election wasn't very polarizing, as each candidate campaigned on older issues while keeping respect for one another. The 28th presidential election was held on November 3, 1896. This election consisted of 7 parties and 1 coalition party. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Populist, Silver, National Democratic, Prohibition, Socialist Labor, and National Prohibition parties. The coalition party was the Democratic, Populist, Silver Party. The Republican Party chose Ohio Governor William McKinley as their presidential nominee, and former president of the New Jersey Senate, Garrett Hobart, as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose the former representative of Nebraska's 1st District, William Jennings Bryan, as their presidential nominee, and Arthur Sewall as their vice presidential nominee. The Republican Party believed that Bryan was overly religious, making him too religious to be president. They also called him a revolutionary that would crash the economy. Bryan's idea was to back the dollar to silver rather than gold. After the governor of Illinois pardoned anarchists responsible for a riot, Republicans started to pin the governor and Bryan together, calling the two of them anarchists. While Catholics supported Bryan, Union workers supported McKinley. Campaigns were also different in this election. Instead of campaigning on what they believed to be right, candidates would campaign on popular issues that would win them donors. McKinley's strategy was to spend as much to get his name out, while Bryan focused on making as many speeches and tours as possible. Bryan ended up giving over 500 speeches to 5 million people in just 100 days. McKinley gave most of his speeches from his front porch, where a total of 500,000 people would listen from. After the Panic of 1893, McKinley's more conservative economic view became more popular. William McKinley ended up winning the election. He won 51.03% of the popular vote and 60.63% of the electoral vote. This was the first election since 1876 where one candidate won over 50% of the popular vote. This election was not very polarizing, but it did change elections forever. From here on out, bringing money into politics would be seen as equally as important as having good stances. The 29th presidential election was held on November 6, 1900. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Prohibition, Social Democratic, Populist, and Social Labor parties. The Republican Party chose President William McKinley as their presidential nominee and Governor of New York Theodore Roosevelt as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party once again chose the former representative of Nebraska's 1st District, William Jennings Bryan, as their presidential nominee, and former Vice President Aldi Stevenson as their vice presidential nominee. As the economy is booming, and America became the victor of the Spanish-American War, the Republicans were by default very popular. Roosevelt was recognized as a war hero for fighting in Cuba. He was also very energetic and was great at giving many powerful speeches in a short period of time. Roosevelt ended up making 480 speeches in 23 states. Bryan, on the other hand, continued to campaign on using the silver standard, which was not popular. Though he supported the Spanish-American War, he did not support the annexation of territories. He believed annexing the new territories would just be America replacing Spain's imperialism with America's. Both sides campaigned the same way they did the last election, except Roosevelt campaigned the same way Bryan did. The war in the Philippines was unpopular but supported by the Republicans. The Filipinos were using guerrilla tactics to rebel from the United States. The United States had never fought a guerrilla war before, so they did not believe there was any path to victory. General MacArthur described the war as so: the success of this unique system of war depends upon almost complete unity of action of the entire native population. That such unity is a fact is too obvious to admit of discussion. How it is brought act and maintained is not so plain. Intimidation has undoubtedly accomplished much to this end, but fear as the only motive is hardly sufficient to account for the united an apparently spontaneous action of several millions of people. One traitor in each town would eventually destroy such a complex organization. It is more probable that the adhesive principle becomes the ethological homogeny, which induces men to respond for a time in the appeals of contagious leadership, even when such action is opposed to their interests and convictions of expediency. In the end, William McKinley was able to win re-election. He won 51.64% of the popular vote and 65.32% of the electoral vote. This election was a bit more polarizing due to the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines. Due to the war being popular at home, it's hard to really call it a super polarizing subject. The 30th presidential election was held on November 8, 1904. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Socialist, Prohibition, Populist, and Social Labor parties. As McKinley was assassinated while in office, Roosevelt stepped up to take charge. The Republican Party chose Theodore Roosevelt as their presidential nominee, and Indiana Senator Charles W. Fairbanks as their vice presidential nominee. The Democratic Party chose Chief Justice of New York Court of Appeals Alden B. Parker as their presidential nominee, and former West Virginia Senator Henry G. Davis as their vice presidential nominee. Both Roosevelt and Parker had similar political views. This ended up making this one of the most respectful campaigns in American history. Democrats thought Parker was too conservative, while conservatives thought Roosevelt was too radical. Roosevelt was criticized for accepting lobbyist money, but it was both sides that were actually accepting lobbyist money. Theodore Roosevelt ended up winning the election. He won 56.42% of the popular vote and 70.59% of the electoral vote. In my opinion, this is one of the least polarizing elections since the early years of the Republic. The 31st presidential election was held on November 3rd, 1908. This election consisted of 7 parties. These parties were the Republican, Democratic, Socialist, Prohibition, Independence, Populist, and Socialist Labor parties. Roosevelt believed that running for re-election would be considered a third term, so he refused to run. He instead endorsed William Taft for president. So the Republican Party chose William Howard Taft as their presidential nominee, and represented for New York's 23rd District James S. Sherman as their vice presidential nominee. For some unseen reason, the Democratic Party for a third time chose William Jennings Bryan as their presidential nominee, and former Indiana Senator John W. Kern as their vice presidential candidate. This time around, Bryan campaigned as a progressive, but Taft and Roosevelt already had a decently progressive platform, so it was hard to really tell the difference between both parties. Republicans even joked about how this was the only election where you could vote Taft, but you could vote for Bryan anytime because even though he lost the previous 2 elections, he for some reason ran again. Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party would make short speeches at multiple cities that ran along the rail network. He did this so he could have a campaign ran from a train, meaning he could literally get his message anywhere in America. Most big businesses and labor unions threw their support behind Taft, making another blow to Bryan's stunning campaign. In the end, William Taft won the election. He won 51.57% of the popular vote and 66.46% of the electoral vote. This election is again not a polarizing one. This is due to both parties having a similar platform. The 32nd presidential election was held on November 5th, 1912. This election consisted of 6 parties. These parties were the Democratic, Progressive, Republican, Socialist, Prohibition, and Socialist Labor parties. The Republican Party chose President William Howard Taft as their presidential nominee, and Vice President James S. Sherman as their vice presidential nominee. For the 4th time in a row, the Democratic Party chose William Jennings Bryan as their presidential nominee. That would be if we lived in a perfect world. In reality, the Democratic Party chose New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson as their presidential nominee, and Governor of Indiana Thomas R. Marshall as their vice presidential nominee. As Roosevelt was unhappy with the performance of Taft as president, he decided to run for a third party. The Progressive Party chose former President Theodore Roosevelt as their presidential nominee, and Governor of California Hiram Johnson as their vice presidential nominee. Roosevelt wanted the government to have strong regulations over the economy to prevent bad corporations from coming about. He discussed his dislike for the political establishment. Wilson believed the economy would regulate itself by having a free market. The philosophy behind this would be if there was a bad business, then people would boycott said business, and the business would go under. This sounds good on paper, but doesn't always work out in reality. Wilson believed that corporations should be broken up rather than regulated. As the anti-establishment and anti-corporate sentiment was picking up, Debs of the Socialist Party stated this in his largest speech, quote, "Only a year ago, working men were throwing decayed vegetables and rotten eggs at us, but now it's all changed. Eggs are too high. There is a great giant growing up in this country that will someday take over the affairs of this nation. He is a little giant, but he is growing fast. The name of this little giant is socialism." He believed that capitalism represented big business while socialism represented the people. On October 14th, Roosevelt was shot by John Schrank. This might be the best name for a political assassin I've ever heard. The bullet went through Roosevelt's eyeglasses case and his 50-page speech, slowing the bullet enough to prevent any critical damage from being done. John's reason for attempting to assassinate Roosevelt was that the ghost of former President McKinley, who was assassinated, told him to kill Roosevelt in an attempt to prevent him from getting a third term. And somehow this guy sounds more sane than most modern politicians. In the end, Woodrow Wilson ended up winning the election. He won 41.84% of the popular vote, which actually isn't too bad since this was a three-way election. He also ended up winning 81.92% of the electoral vote. This is the best performance in the Electoral College vote since 1860, or when Abraham Lincoln was first elected as president. This election was more polarizing than the last due to the infighting within the Republican Party, causing the party to split. So, what can we learn from this era of politics? We can learn that this was the era where politics went from campaigning on important issues to campaigning on the character of a person. This election introduced big money into politics, which then in turn brought corruption into politics.